Chapter 29, we'll be talking about plant diversity on how plants colonize the land. More, we'll be discussing seed plants also, and seedless vascular plants, such as ferns. Plants evolved from green algae, more specifically charophytes. There is morphological and molecular evidence to support this. Multicellular eukaryotic and photosynthetic autotrophs, cell walls made of cellulose, and chloroplasts with chlorophyll alpha and beta are traits shared by plants, algae, and other protists. But traits shared by plants and green algae only consist of rings of cellulose, synthesizing proteins, structure of flagellated sperm, and similarities in cell division. The DNA research also supports this relationship. So how did algae transition from water to land? Well, of course, evolution. Natural selection favored individual algae that could not survive when they were not submerged. So here's a body of water, and the shallow bank is represented by the greenish shade, the shaded of green, and the deeper body of water is represented by the blue shade. Algae near the shallow banks, natural selection would favor algae that can resist drying from fluctuated water levels. Because on the shallow banks, algae that lived in shallow banks had the benefit of unfiltered sunlight because they were not competing with other algae, plentiful CO2, they're more closer to the surface, thus having more exposure to CO2 and rich soil. Sporopollenin prevents exposed zygotes from drying out, which is found in plant spore walls. The differences between plants and algae, plants have an alternation of generations, which means a back and forth between sporophyte and gametophyte generations. Plants also have multicellular dependent embryos, or seeds, retained in female tissues, which is a fruit, which we'll be discussing in the next lecture, chapter 30. Apical meristems allowed roots to elongate throughout the plant's life, and walled spores produced in sporangia. There is 10 phylum of existing plants today, which is this one, and this one. It's a lot of names. And we'll be discussing vascular plants and seedless vascular plants. And also non-vascular plants, which is bryophytes. So we'll be discussing mainly these today. During the evolutionary history of plants, most plants have vascular tissue, which is xylem and phloem. A seed is an embryo and nutrient surrounded by a protective coat, which is only found in angiosperms and gymnosperms. Bryophytes are represented today by 3 phylum of small herbaceous and non-woody plants: liverworts, mosses, and hornworts. We'll be discussing the life cycle of a moss right here. Or, I think it's a hornwort, but of a bryophyte. Let's say a bryophyte. Starting with the spores. The spores grow into a male gametophyte or a female gametophyte. The male gametophyte is its independent structure, and the female gametophyte is its independent structure. So there's 2 sexes of plants. Protonemata is how the spores develop into greenery or vegetation specifically. Well, not specifically. and it will keep reproducing, will keep budding off from the parent cell until it becomes a male gametophyte. The male gametophyte has antheridia, which produces sperm, while the female gametophyte has archegonia, which produces eggs. Bryophytes are restricted to moist and wet environments because they have flagellated sperm. The water allows the sperm to swim to the archegonia and fertilize the egg. Once the egg is fertilized and becomes an embryo, it will grow and grow to a young sporophyte, this long stalk right here. Then the sporophyte will grow on top of the female gametophyte. Sporophytes do not have photosynthetic organs, or they do not have leaves, or they do not have chlorophyll. So sporophytes are completely dependent on the gametophyte, on the female gametophyte. So the female gametophyte supplies the sporophyte with water, nutrients, and sugars. Many bryophytes also reproduce asexually. Some mosses produce brood bodies, small plantlets that detach from the parent plant and grow into genetically identical copies of their parent. So for example, if I cut my arm off, my arm would grow and grow into its individual me. It's identical. Mosses are capable of inhabiting extreme environments. They can withstand losing water, while vascular plants lose water. And some mosses reduce nitrogen loss from the soil. Others harbor nitrogen-fixing cyanobacteria or microbes. This allows for plants to take advantage of the nitrogen that has been fixed by this moss or bryophytes that harbor microbes that fix nitrogen. Ferns and other seedless vascular plants were the first plants to grow tall. Vascular tissue allowed plants to grow tall, in which the plants that we see today. All gymnosperms and angiosperms, all those tall growing plants, have vascular tissues. Living vascular plants were characterized by life cycles with a dominant sporophyte, and bryophytes, which we discussed the life cycle of a bryophyte up here, is mainly a gametophyte dominant generation, while a vascular plant has a sporophyte dominated generation. A generation that's dominated by sporophyte. Vascular tissues called xylem and phloem, and well-developed roots and leaves. Since the sporophyte was dominant and independent, this allowed them to have larger and more complex sporophytes. So the sporophytes in vascular plants were independent from the gametophyte. Remember, in bryophytes, the sporangia was completely dependent from the female gametophyte. So we'll be discussing a fern life cycle, starting with the spores. The spores disperse, it becomes a young gametophyte. In ferns, the gametophyte is bisexual. There is no two sexes. One plant structure creates egg and sperm. Antheridium makes the sperm, and the archegonium makes the eggs. After fertilization occurs, the zygote will grow into a sporophyte. The sporophyte will continue growing while the gametophyte will die off, and the mature sporophyte is the dominant generation. And under the leaves of ferns, there is sporangium, where spores are being made and being dispersed and causing the cycle to begin once again. Okay, I'm proud. Okay, I'm proud of myself. Transport in xylem and phloem. Vascular plants have two types of vascular tissue, xylem and phloem. Xylem conducts most of the water and minerals, while phloem has cells arranged into tubes that distribute sugars and amino acids. So think of phloem, one way to remember this is think of phloem. Phloem starts with a P, photosynthesis starts with a P. Phloem distributes sugars around the plant. I'm so sorry, I sneezed. Xylem conducts most of the water, while phloem distributes sugars. Roots are organs that anchor vascular plants and absorb water and nutrients from the soil. Roots may have evolved from subterranean stems. Okay. Leaves are organs that increase surface area of vascular plants, thereby capturing more solar energy that is used for photosynthesis. There are two types of leaves, microphylls and megaphylls. Microphylls are small, spine-shaped leaves with a single vein, while megaphylls are more complex and have a branched vascular system. So right here is a microphyll leaf. You see how there's one vein, while in megaphyll leaves, there is a branched system of vascular tissues. Leaves can also be modified with sporangia, and leaves with sporangia are called sporophylls. Sori are clusters of sporangia on the underside of sporophylls. Strobili are cone-like structures formed from groups of sporophylls. In most seedless vascular plants, there's homospory. Homospory means that the plant with a sporophyte produces a single type of spore, mainly microspores. And the spore and the microspore spore will typically make a bisexual gametophyte that produces both eggs and sperm. In gymnosperms and angiosperms, or seed plants, heterospory is present, meaning that there is megaspores and microspores. The microsporangium will make microspores, and the microspore will make a male gametophyte that makes sperm, while the megasporangium will make megaspores, which will make a female gametophyte that makes eggs. A lycophyta. Giant lycophyta thrived for millions of years in moist swamps, and then they declined dry. They declined when the climate became dry during the Permian period. Living lycophytes are small herbaceous plants. So here's a picture of some lycophytes. Millenniophyta, which is ferns. Well, yeah, ferns. Ferns are the most widespread seedless vascular plants with more than 12,000 species. Ferns are the most diverse in the tropics, but also thrive in temperate forests. Horsetails were the most diverse during the Carboniferous period, but they are now restricted to the genus Equisetum. I think I said that right. So the closing of this lecture, we'll be talking about the significance of seedless vascular plants. The ancestors of modern lycophytes, horsetails, and ferns grew tall during the Devonian and Carboniferous, forming the first forests. There were so many plants in the Carboniferous period that it contributed to a drop in CO2 levels causing global cooling. As we see today, where there's global warming due to the high levels of CO2 in our atmosphere, it is the complete opposite what happened during the Carboniferous period. So, since ferns and horsetails love to live in moist environments and hot climates, they sucked up so much CO2 that it caused global cooling. The global cooling made the climate a little colder, thus creating the downfall of the Carboniferous era. Today, most of the coal that we harvest from the ground is a bunch of ferns and horsetails from the Carboniferous era because the ferns sucked up so much CO2 that it became carbon when they died or when they become fossilized. The ferns and horsetails and other similar plants also isolated carbon from rock by the roots secreting acids. The acids will destroy the rock, disposing them into the ocean, separating coal and rock, making them more distinguishable.